The Evolution of a Culture, a program from the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. In this program, one of a series developed out of the Center's conference on the theories of behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner, attention moves to the cultural and political implications of operant conditioning. One of the most important implications, to Dr. Skinner's mind, is that man can have the power to control the ways in which his own culture evolves. Dr. Skinner begins the program by enlarging on this point.
I want to come now to a third type of evolution, which seems to me to be the very heart of the issues we're discussing. The evolution of a culture is at issue. Now, the anthropologists have often talked about that as simply an established sequence of stages through which a culture passes, but that is too close to a mere structuralism, and I think we have to argue that there is a true evolution going on in the sense that a group of people hit upon some practice which makes them more likely to meet the contingencies of survival which they face and to transmit that practice to others. The mechanism which provides for what looks like a violation of the rule against final causes is that of the overlapping membership in groups of people. They can collect and transmit new practices after the death of the person in whom the practice first appeared. Now, this is a matter in which a culture acquires ways of doing things which make it more likely to survive. Each person in the culture continues to behave because of the consequences of his behavior. But under the contingencies which develop in a group of people, some may become tyrants and despots, either because they have religious or governmental or economic power. Others become controlees who submit to the sanctions and suasions imposed by such people. The controlees can, however, react against those who emerge in the position of strong controllers, and you have a kind of counter-control which works to restrain, to contain the power of those who acquire that distinguishing position. In every case, something is done because of the consequences to the person who does it. However, as a culture generates some kind of understanding of human behavior, both the controller and counter-controller may behave in new ways because of predicted consequences. This becomes now a kind of design in which you work out better ways of doing things, better ways of raising children, better ways of paying wages, better ways of collecting taxes. This is all done because of predicted improved consequences, better consequences. But then, of course, the question arises, better for whom? And the answer there is better for the person who invents the practice or, when it's already in existence, resorts to it in controlling other people. And if you simply stop at the level of those who have power and those who use power against those who have power, the controller and the counter-controller, you reach the stage in which there is some kind of equilibrium, temporary equilibrium at least, emerging. Labor proposes changes in industrial practices which benefit labor. Capital proposes changes which benefit capital. Teachers propose changes which benefit teachers. Students propose changes which benefit students, and so on. And these opposing parties may arrive at some kind of stable situation which will last perhaps a long time, but is not by any means the best situation for either the individual or the general good. But the common good, the general good, the common weal is not the only appeal, because if you look at the evolution of a culture, then you can take the future of the culture into account as something beyond the goods which explain the behavior of those in the culture. Something new emerges when a culture reaches the point at which some of its members begin to take its future into account. And when it reaches that stage, a scientific analysis of behavioral processes becomes particularly important, because the future of the culture is a rather remote kind of thing to be brought to bear on the behavior of the individual. And the understanding of the very fact that an evolutionary process is going on is essential. Once those things are available, once you have a technology of behavior and some concern about the future of the culture, then it is possible to accelerate the process of evolution by what is quite correctly, I think, called design. And that works at all three of these levels I've mentioned. We've just now reached a stage at which we can begin to talk about interfering with genetic transmission and hence with the evolution of the species. We're not yet able to do very much, but it can be done. Those who are concerned about the effectiveness of the human organism, resistance to disease and so on, are beginning to talk about possible changes in genetic structure which will lead to certain advantages. In the field of the behavior of the individual, you have the possibility of deliberate design which will make the individual more effective. This is done in any kind of field such as education or industry and so on, where changes are made which make the individual more likely to behave with reinforcing consequences for himself or for others. Certainly at the level of the culture, this is done. We design practices with an eye to the effect on the future of the culture. And this is more than just designing changes in practice because someone gains personally or some general good is improved. It has to do with some long-term changes which I think can be called a kind of gigantic act of self-control. I think man is slowly producing an environment in which the human organism is able to behave more and more effectively. And once that process is recognized, then those who have some understanding of the basic behavioral mechanisms can begin to take the successful development of such a culture into account. And by culture, of course, I mean nothing more than a social environment. The designer who is influenced by a predicted future, by the prediction of a future, is not meddling, he's not stepping into a process, he is part of that process. He does not become a tyrant or a despot. And the question which is always asked, who is to control when a technology of behavior supplies new kinds of controlling power, certainly is not to be answered by giving a proper name. You don't want to know the actual person. You may feel you want to know the kind of person who will control. Will he be benevolent, for example? Will he exercise compassion? That, I think, is again the old mistake of looking for some person, looking inside a person to alleviate our fears. If you ask why those who are in control of other people control compassionately or benevolently, you have to look at the kinds of counter-control which are being impressed upon them. And you can see that in those special cases in which people have been classically mistreated. The treatment of small children in orphanages, old people in old people's homes, prisons, retardates, and psychotics. All these institutions are traditional examples of mistreatment. And the reason is not that the people who run them are not compassionate or benevolent, but that the people in those institutions cannot exert counter-control. They can't escape, they can't revolt against the controlling authorities. And in such systems, people who may begin with compassion will find themselves behaving in careless or cruel ways. You can step in and impose counter-control, as is often done to change conditions of mistreatment of that kind, but there is something else which can be done by a third party who look at the situation and sees whether the prevailing practices cannot be improved. And I think the thing that we are getting around to here is the role of the cultural designer, someone who is concerned with the practices of a culture as they bear on the strength of the culture, not as they bear on his own emoluments, his own gains, or the gains of those around him who in turn would reinforce him if he works for their gain. Can a culture give rise to practices and people who practice them which are concerned with, specifically, with the strength of the culture, rather than with gaining power for the individual or controlling the misuse of power by others? Those who have the behavioral technology needed, and those who have been strongly convinced by their culture that the future of the culture is important, will be such people. They will not be those who step into positions of control. They are advisors, they are technologists who will be concerned with a culture, not with aggrandizing the power of any one person. So what we have to look forward to is the evolution of a culture in which the power which flows from a technology of behavior will be used to promote the culture itself rather than for the personal aggrandizement of a leader or a dictator. We are not looking for a person to emerge who will do a good job as a philosopher king. We are looking for a culture to emerge in which those who possess the necessary power and the interest in the future of the culture will be able to function. Many of the critics of my book have said that although I myself may not be a fascist, I am giving aid and comfort to fascism. Well, I certainly do not supply additional helpful techniques to the fascist type of government of which I've ever had any information. They are almost invariably punitive, and I've done a great deal to oppose punitive practices and to try to discover alternatives. But I think any way of life can profit from gains in our understanding of human behavior. And I have no doubt that if there are people who wish to promote totalitarian patterns, then they will benefit from what we are discovering about human behavior. But whether I give fascism an advantage, that's the main issue. And that will only happen if a non-totalitarian way of life refuses to accept the help which flows from such a technology. And that is, I think, the point of my book. Are the literatures of freedom and dignity now having the effect of preventing the use of what is being learned about human behavior? Have we, in some curious way, created a situation in which we cannot use our heads to promote our own future? If that is the case, then I am indeed giving an advantage to fascism, but I should say that is the thing about which I'm most concerned, and I would like to see the goals of democracy put first rather than its current practices, so that better practices can be devised.
The first question is asked by Harry S. Ashmore, president of the Center.
The person who's exercising counter-control is consciously resisting what he deems to be an invasion of his freedom and dignity, isn't he?
Well, a person who does all this will say that about himself, and we'll talk about it, but that brings up the question I mentioned yesterday about whether what he says to himself or what he feels about the system is indeed causal, or whether under these conditions he acts and describes his own state and his state of his own body and his actions in such a way. And there's no doubt that this kind of reflection about what you are doing, the reasons you give for what you're doing, are extremely important, but I believe they can be analyzed in a behavioral way.
The political scientist is interested in finding a selection system.
Yes.
Which will do the things that you're talking about.
Rexford Tugwell, Center Fellow.
And this seems to me to be something that you haven't really treated.
I grasp your word selection immediately because I think that is what I'm talking about. I really believe that we are looking for someone who will select among current processes those which are more likely to advance a predicted future or to solve the problems of a predicted future.
Well, the political scientist, in dealing with the way in which you do this, has got a very severe technological problem, too. This selection process is...
The question, I take it, Rex, is how do we arrange things so that only the proper third-party culture designers get into the position of designing cultures?
Yes, how do we get them there, and what institutions do we establish so that they can operate?
Yes, well, I wish I had the answer to that, too.
I was dissatisfied with the conclusion of Professor Skinner's closing remarks in his presentation.
Elizabeth Mann Borghese is a fellow of Center.
It did not convince me, because it seems to me that the whole argument he makes against the literature of freedom and dignity, a fortiori, is against democracy, and that the manipulation or control of human behavior and democracy is a contradictio in adjecto. You can have one or you can have the other. So therefore, and from this point of view, I think that I agree with the critics that claim that you work in favor of a totalitarian system.
Well, I'm sorry that you do feel that way. I believe that I have accepted the goals of the struggle for freedom and dignity, but I'm examining the actual behavioral processes, and am very much concerned that they are now standing in the way of their own goals. I want people to be freer from aversive control than they've ever been. If that is one of the goals of democracy, I'm for it. I want people to be achieving, to do more than they've ever done before. If that's what you mean by personal worth and dignity, then I'm all for it. What I'm saying is that the traditional struggle is perpetuating the use of punitive practices and denying us the use of techniques which will make us more achieving than we are now.
In fact, I would not go so far as to call it fascism, because fascism, in fact, is punitive and aversive, and your system is not, and this is a very great and basic difference. But I cannot call it democracy, as I cannot call Plato's philosopher king an embodiment of democracy. It's the opposite of democracy. It is another concept of human society altogether.
I just do not believe that, because I'm not looking for a person. I'm not looking for a philosopher king. I'm not looking for any ruler. I am looking for a culture in which people will use techniques in certain ways, and that means the total population, the total social environment arranged and maintained by a people. If you want to control and suppress the processes which are now polluting the environment, the only people you can appeal to are the masses of people who will suffer if those things go on. You're not going to appeal to the industry that is just pouring stuff into a river. You've got to appeal to those who are no longer able to eat fish, because that stuff gets out into the ocean and poisons everyone. So I think you've got to work through the culture, and the culture is nothing more than the social environment maintained by people.
I think there's a difference between democracy and mass democracy, if we could make that fine distinction.
Dennis Paragas, professor of political science at Stanford University.
We think about democracy, we think about Athens or ancient Greece. We don't realize that that was not a mass democracy as we understand it. It was a democracy of the elite only. Not everyone had a vote. Now, one of the papers mentions that democracy is the most stable form of government that we know. And the question before us is, how can we have any kind of a transformation of a culture in an ultra-stable society? Democracy is, in reality, the most stable form of government that exists, because it's deeply rooted among the people.
I accept that, and I think it not only is stable, but it has produced more science, more of the affluence which enables us to take advantage of science and any other form of culture, but I don't believe it's the last form.
Democracy as we practice it now is certainly not democracy as we practiced it 50 years ago or 20 years ago.
Dr. Vitaly Rosenko is project director of the Operant Behavior Modification Project at Mendocino State Hospital in California.
Things are changing, and things are going to continue to change.
At a certain moment when I was reading the book, I was struck by the parallelity which might exist between your thinking and Marxist thinking.
Leo Gabriel is a visiting center fellow.
There are many, many differences. I only want to point out I could see the parallel.
It's been said that Marx was a behaviorist, and it is true that he very much emphasized the environments in which people live and behave. But he was not what I would call a behaviorist, because he felt that the environment determines consciousness, and consciousness then determines behavior. I just don't want to go through that middle stage as he did. I think he put, not Marx so much himself, but Marxism puts too much emphasis on purely economic contingencies. I think there's a playing down of other social contingencies, education and so on. I believe that the whole class struggle kind of thing was a misrepresentation. I'd like to see the whole Marxist history of class struggle reinterpreted in terms of controlling variables. But I wouldn't be a bit surprised if what I'm suggesting is not closer to Marx than I think it is. But that doesn't bother me one way or the other.
I would think at some place along the line, perhaps Dr. Skinner would have to get into the political arrangements that would seem to be most feasible or most practicable for the distribution of the power that all of us are talking about, the power that's going to be wielded in the society.
Donald MacDonald, executive editor of the Center magazine.
I think your earlier statement, Dr. Skinner, that all the people are going to somehow control themselves and control the culture, I think that concept or that idea has to be refined, because I think in fact it's impracticable to expect that all the people are going to be able to do it. So therefore we get back to some of the old conventional notions of politics, which is distribution of power, allocation of power, counter controls, and so on.
To whom can we appeal to change the rate of growth of the population, the pollution of the environment, except those who will suffer from this? Everyone.
Right.
Everyone is the final authority here, from which we will derive the power to contain those who are causing trouble.
Mr. MacDonald at this point refined his question by asking about the possibility of the controller in an operantly conditioned society usurping despotic power. Harvey Wheeler, Center Fellow, has this comment.
If you talk about it as a new profession, it does raise the question of philosopher kings. But if it is a true profession, it's not capable professionally of producing aversive environmental controls. It's capable only of producing positive reinforcement type controls. That, again, in some sense, by definition, would be more democratic.
John Cogley, Center Fellow, here asked what changes are likely to take place in man if the literature of freedom and dignity is replaced by behaviorist literature. What will the new man be like? Dr. Skinner answers,
I think the primary change would be that he would look not to the individual himself for solutions to his problems, but to the world in which he lives. Take the revolt of the youth, the disaffection and revolt of young people. You can say it's due to alienation, a sense of hopelessness, of ruthlessness. You can talk about all kinds of things in young people as if something were wrong with them. In each case, you can actually point to what is wrong in the environment. If they leave home, it's not because they are alienated, but because the home is no longer a very reinforcing environment. If they don't get jobs, it's not because they're shiftless or lazy. It's because industry has not set up good incentive conditions. If they don't go to school, it's because of the practices that go on in school. So you turn to the external conditions, which are accounting for the revolt and disaffection of the young.
What would a behavioralist literature establish as the traits that a society thinks it's desirable to enforce?
John Cogley.
That's basically my question.
Yes, well, that would have to be derived from what behaviorists would think is going to be important to the future of the culture. Very hard to predict what the culture is going to need, or how to introduce the behaviors which will satisfy the contingencies of survival when they arise, but there's nothing else to be done. There's no other way out. And we have to make a try. And I think it's a very good thing if young people are educated and develop the very best talents they possess, that they produce the goods they need without being compulsively overworked or without being shiftless and wasteful in what they do, and so on. I could start on a long line of those and make my guesses as to the kind of behavior which is most likely to make for the future of this way of life.
The kind of idea that I get of the culture projected here is that of an Oriental culture without fatalism.
Without what?
Without fatalism. That is, it is a culture based on infinite power and on infinite lack of power at the same time. And the groping for the new philosopher king, for the new profession, all of that seems to me a very profound contradiction built into the whole system.
Well, I certainly haven't made myself clear, because I don't want a philosopher king to be ruling. I want specialists to design particular practices. I'm not talking about a monolithic global thing called a state or a culture or anything of the sort. I mean, let's go in and work out better ways of teaching, better ways of getting people to produce the goods they need, and so on. Now that looks to me to be a non-totalitarian kind of thing, if I ever saw one.
So long as it remains at the level of what I would not even like to call a technology, but a technique, I'm 100% with you, 100%. But once it is elevated to these levels of discourse, then I'm caught in contradictions, which so far you have not been able to dispel.
Well, I'm sorry, because I don't see them as contradictions myself. I'll think them over.
On a somewhat earlier point, I think.
Halleck Hoffman is Dean of the School of Critical Studies at the California Institute of the Arts.
If the propositions about behavior modification are true, if they are correct, if that's the way it works, then they've been working all along, from the very beginning. They always do happen. It appears to me that what Skinner's talking about is consciousness raising. Here is some information about how some aspects of the reorganization of society take place. We can either deprive ourselves of that information, or we can accept it and make use of it, and presumably make the best use of it we know how.
You have been listening to one in a series of programs recorded during a conference held to discuss with Professor B.F. Skinner the theories in his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity. This program originated at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara.